here to speak with us today. And so as a first step, let me invite them all to the stage. So if I could request our speakers who are seated in the front row to join us on stage, and I'll announce their names one by one. We have Dr. Samir Sharma, former Chief Secretary, Government of Andhra Pradesh. Dr. Sharma, would you join us on the stage? Thank you. Dr. Debolina Kundu, Director, Additional Charge, NIUA. Dr. Poornima Dore, Economist at XLRI, Jamshedpur. Mridula Ramesh, Founder, Sundaram Climate Institute. Mr. Rogier Berg, Global Director for WRI Center for Sustainable Cities. And Madhav Pai, CEO, WRI India. Thank you. We're honored to have you all here. Thank you for being with us. We are also expecting Srinivas Katikithala to join us in some time, Secretary of Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. So for now, I will introduce Jaya Dhindaw, Executive Program Director for Sustainable Cities at WRI India, and she'll be giving the welcome address and moderating this panel. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's joined here. Post-lunch sessions can be difficult, but thank you everyone for being here. I promise you it will be exciting. And we're here to talk about urbanization, India's urbanization, transformation, growth story, and what's happening there. Oops. So basically, first I'll start with dispelling sort of three myths, right? So we hear about how rapidly urbanizing India is and how the cities are growing at a very fast pace. Well, the first thing is India's urbanization is not rapid, has not been. It is slow or moderate at best, right? So that's the first. The second one is we say that our large cities are growing, there's the agglomeration that's happening, and cities are adding a lot of populations. While that is true, small towns are also increasing in numbers, and they have been over the last 2 decades now. Myth number 3, we also keep thinking about how urbanization is an irreversible process. Well, the fact of the matter is that growth is an irreversible process. Urbanization, as it is in our case, in the case of India, is not irreversible, it is reversible. And I'll have my colleague explain some of these fun facts later. But for now, to just give this session some color, let me start by saying that our urbanization has clearly resulted in sort of a sprawling pattern of growth, which is territorially diverse, dispersed and multi-scalar. So what that means is, on the one hand, we have cities, megacities exceeding 20 million population, but India's urbanization also has a very long tail, and we have a bunch of towns with just a few thousand people. What this is leading to is, resource inefficiency in terms of land utilization, also without adequate resources and consideration for environmental protection. So that is how it's characterizing and playing out. Now, beyond governance, this kind of a differentiated urbanization has implications about how resources are also allocated and distributed across different class, type, size of cities. Now, by the end of the decade, India aspires to be a US 10 trillion economy. We've heard that. Now, to realize these big ambitions, we don't need to think in just terms of big cities, and we want to leverage the power of all cities, all urban areas, the smaller ones as well, to become the engines of low carbon, resilient, and inclusive growth. Now, today I have the pleasure of having a group of people with me who wear several hats, and I'll talk about that as I introduce each of them during the discussion. But they have thought about this more deeply and are here to share some insights on the multifaceted dimensions of India's urbanization, the potential pathways towards a diverse and differentiated but low carbon, resilient, and inclusive growth, which does not have too many terrible negative ramifications, and we will hear from them. For now, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Sudeshna Chatterjee, Director of Research at the Sustainable Cities Program for WRI India, to share some context for the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. Distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, a very good afternoon to all of you. When we are talking about transforming Indian cities, the first question really that comes to most people's mind is how urban is India? Yes, we are still working with 2011 census data. That is the recognized figure of India's urbanization, 31.1%. But some other facts in continuation with what Jaya was saying. India's cities actually occupy only 3% of India's land, but they have a very large share of the GDP is actually produced in India's cities to the tune of almost 60%. We also have a lot of ambitions, right, to become net zero by 2070, to become a $30 trillion economy by 2047, etc. So just to put things in perspective, what's happening globally. Jaya talked about that India actually is not urbanizing rapidly, as many papers seem to claim. We actually have a very moderate level of urbanization, but the scale of our urbanization is very large. What do we mean by that? So the largest urban population is to be found in China, which is over 800 million. Our population, about 400 million, is half of that. But we have the second largest urban population in the world. But another fun fact that in comparison to China, which only has about 700 cities, we have close to 8,000 towns and cities. And I'm not even going down the order to the other countries. Now, this pattern of this large numbers of towns and cities actually gives us a very unique pattern of urbanization, which we call planetary urbanization. What do we mean by that? That towns and cities are not only to be found within urban agglomerations near bigger cities, but also in non-urban areas. All over the country, we do see a lot of very small towns which are not related to large cities at all. Now, this contrast of the pattern of urbanization, this is just the BRICS countries. If you see the other countries, there is a sort of regional concentration of urban areas, whereas in India, it is all over. So this is a very, very unique pattern of dispersed, diverse urbanization that we have. What drives urbanization in India? Now, again, there's basically three main drivers. This is analysis of 2011 data again. So the first one is, of course, natural increase of population in cities. The second one is, again, a very uniquely Indian phenomenon of reclassifying rural areas into urban areas through two different pathways, which I'll discuss later. And this we call in situ urbanization. This is actually bigger than rural to urban migration's contribution to urban growth in Indian cities. So that's also a myth that needs busting, that migration is really not adding to urban growth. The two pathways by which we declare urban are that state governments can declare areas urban through statutory towns, which is an administrative pathway. The second is the census can declare certain areas as urbans, basically based on their population, the density, and their economic activity outside of the non-farm sector. In the last census decade, we have seen a very large number of census towns being added to our urban areas without any kind of municipal services being given, because they do not have the governance structure, which gives us the tag of messy urbanization. And also the fact that what we will consider urban in the next census, that frame is drawn up based on the previous census data, the urban and rural frame. So by the time we declare certain areas urban, that data is 10 years old. So there is a considerable gap and hidden urbanization in India, which also is something that we need to discuss. Now, across the states, there's great diversity between the north and the south, and of course, within states as well. In the north, typically, there is rapid population growth due to high fertility rates, but lower levels of urbanization because of the economic criteria we have in our definition of urban, that it has to be a certain percentage has to work in non-farm sectors, but there is greater dependence on agriculture in the northern states, as compared to southern India, where population growth is slower, but there is much more growth in non-farm economic activities, which is why they're adding many more towns, especially census towns, as well as statutory towns. Within districts in each state, there is tremendous diversity also. Even in the most urbanized states, there will be districts which are not very urbanized. Only 12% of India's districts are over 50% urbanized. Over 40% of districts actually have an urbanization level which is the same as pre-1961. They are less than 20% urbanized. So we actually do see this variation across districts. Now we will talk about just 5 policy opportunities based on our work on the National Urbanization Policy. The first one is that our large cities tend to be categorized as class 1 cities in India based on census criteria, and they can go from 1 lakh or 100,000 population to over 20 million. Now, many other credible sources like the UN or URDPFI has asked for disaggregation of these categories for more targeted policy actions, because a town of 1 lakh has very different needs from a city of 20 million. The second fact is that we really need to bring a focus on small towns in our national programs. Why? Because 92% of India's urban centers have a population of less than 1 lakh. And this is true for both census towns and statutory towns. So the numbers of small towns are going up, but the population in them are going down. The third policy opportunity is that most large cities are actually growing outside of their municipal boundaries in peri-urban areas. Currently, we have no system for accounting for peri-urban growth, and hence no policies for managing or nurturing that growth. And there are new tools like the UN degree of urbanization, which allows us to capture this peri-urban growth, and we are actually working with this tool to understand India's peri-urbanization. So once this peri-urban or urban expansions happen, we need planning and managing, right? Because most of this growth is happening in sometimes even mandated blue-green areas, as in the case of that map shown in the case of Bangalore. And our study of blue-green infrastructure across 10 cities have shown that 44% of new development across 10 Indian cities are located in zones with high or very high recharge potential. So unless we address these, we will increase the climate burdens of our cities. And the last policy opportunity that I'll talk about is, again, related to this urban expansion that is happening, that we really do not have the proper governance structure for managing them. Currently, it is very weak and fragmented with overlapping jurisdictions at local, state, and development authorities and parastatals, which really create a really terrible mix for us to work with. So who's really responsible for this regional urbanization that we are seeing at scale across India? So just to summarize, to end with that, urbanization in India does offer a lot of opportunities despite very large challenges. We know 70% of the built environment and infrastructure are yet to be built. And there is a massive push for infrastructure spend in India through the National Infrastructure Pipeline to the tune of almost $1 trillion by 2025. So all this really gives us an opportunity to build more sustainably, low carbon, equitable, and prosperous cities. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Jaya to introduce the panel and moderate the session. Thank you.
It's a lot of information to sort of absorb and grasp, and we'll sort of unpack that a little bit more with the discussion here today. I just want to mention that Mr. Srinivas, Secretary of Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, will be joining us in some time, and we'll get started. So first, Dr. Ramesh, I'm going to start with you. Dr. Sharma was the former Chief Secretary of Andhra Pradesh. Dr. Sharma, you've worn several hats over the last close to 4 decades now. You're a seasoned scholar, administrator with experience in public governance, particularly in urban development. You work with Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs yourself. You've served in pivotal roles both at the state and central government levels and significantly contributed to India's reforms through initiatives like the Smart Cities Mission and Andhra. Most recently, you were the Chief Secretary of Andhra Pradesh and also the Chief Executive of the government on the SDGs and Chairman of the Andhra Pradesh Pollution Control Board. So first of all, a very warm welcome and we're glad to have you here, Dr. Sharma. So now, based on what you've seen, we'll talk about small towns first, based on the presentation that you just saw. So given that urbanization is dispersed, diverse, differentiated, what do you think should be the development pathway of smaller cities and towns? They are the ones which are most neglected. I'm talking about urban areas which are 1 lakh and smaller, but also 50,000, 5,000 and so on. Because they're growing in numbers and not in population, and to ensure the kind of development that yields positive human, environmental, and economic dividends.
Thank you, Jaya. I'll answer this question in 2 parts. The first part is just briefly take you through what's happened in India in the last 75 years, 2-3 minutes. And there are 3 spatial models which have emerged in India, and one of the spatial models is the small cities, less than 1 lakh population. And then tell you the pathway, as they call the action intervention. That I'll tell you. I made a small tabular form. I'll not go through it completely, but a little bit, and if you want more, I will. See, urbanization of India can be divided into 4 phases. The first phase started in 1857 when the British really started working in Indian settlements hands down. After that, this up to 1947. From 1947 to 1991 was the third phase. Why I say 1991? Because 1988 the National Commission of Urbanization gave its report, and 1991 India opened up, including the land sector, the land use, master plannings were rendered open. Then 1991 till present. So at the end of each stage there was a certain spatial pattern in India. 1947, the spatial pattern was largely what we call in the form of dendrites, which are in your brain, which means these 4 big cities with linear connections and few other small cities built up as taluk towns, district headquarters, or wherever agriculture market committees were required to build towns like Nasik, Aurangabad. 47 to 91, I would say urban was subordinated development. In the constitution, the word urban was never used. It was part of social sector. Even in funding, Planning Commission kept it in the social sector. Up to the 70s, the only focus on urban was on housing. First time they recognized that small and medium towns were not developing in India. The entire hierarchy or the balance structure was becoming more imbalanced. And they started the integrated development of small and medium towns in the 70s. It didn't work. Then 90s, they started a mega cities program. And then the 2000, we had the JNURM, which is an infrastructure program. Largely, these were big programs, but there were a lot of in-between slum development programs, and housing continued, particularly slum housing, which initially it was removing the slum, then it was upgrading the slum in situ, all that things went on happening. So in 1991, NCU says there was a complete separation of sectoral planning from investment planning. They used to just give money in sectoral outlays, but that spatial component was missing. Master plan had become something which was only interested in giving building permissions, changing land use. This is what the National Commission on Urbanization said, led by Charles Correa. After that, India opened up. And information technology. So in 1991, we had the big 4 cities, few class 1 developing, but by and large, all the focus was on the big cities. 1991 onwards, information technology made big 4 into big 6, Hyderabad and Bangalore joined. Largely information technology driven, but also because of the attention of government. So now as Jaya and her team have found, growth is occurring in 3 areas. The first is peri-urban. 2011 census, 91 urban agglomerations were there in 2011. Increase in population of million plus cities from 35 in 2001 to 53. They accounted for around 42% of urban population. The second was small urban center, which are statutory towns, and the census towns. 2001 to 2011, there was an addition of around 2,500 census towns. from 1947 till 2001, there was an addition of 2,500. So what happened from 47 to 2001 happened in 10 years. This is the acceleration which happened. So the third is what is happening. Other day I was speaking to some, these headhunters who recruit C-suite executives and other executives. And one Siddharth Verma, he's head of one firm, he told me the focus now, information technology, has shifted to tier 2. GCCs now are looking at tier 2. Tier 2, which he mentioned, Jaipur, Coimbatore, Kochi, Mangalore, Lucknow, etc. And the emerging techno hubs, 10 to 15% are coming in these cities. So the future is these cities, we have to get ready for that, as you all were saying. Otherwise, we again have to do it, retrofit it again. So this is what is emerging in India. Now, it's not that this was not recognized that small towns and medium towns should be developed. National Commission on Urbanization at that time identified cities and said they should be developed economically. And they sort of categorized them into national priority centers, state priority centers, generators of economic momentum, GEMS, and SPURS, special priority urban regions. In 88, they saw this. They sort of predicted this. And what they predicted actually has happened. So now, there are 3 spatial models which have emerged. I'll not go into theory. If you want offline, we can talk. First is the mega city or the world city or the global city, where there's one first city anchoring development all around it, the peri-urban areas, which are Chennai, Mumbai, Calcutta, and now Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Delhi. The second is, so this is one form, and there are states which have this as the predominant form. So Telangana, predominant form is first city-led development. West Bengal, first city-led development. Even to a certain extent, Maharashtra, Mumbai-led development, but it's a hybrid form. The other are states which have a dispersed set of settlements. They've had it historically. Punjab, it had 4-5 cities. Then Uttar Pradesh, Kawal towns, Kanpur, Allahabad, Varanasi, Agra, and Lucknow. Then there are emerging hybrid cities like Andhra Pradesh, which has a dispersed form but now a big city, Vizag or Amravati. Gujarat, again a dispersed form, but you may have a big city. Ahmedabad may become a first city. So you have these 3 spatial forms. Now, when you have these 3 spatial forms, what are the development activities or the actions? A lot of them are common, but some are extremely differentiated. So it's a common and differentiated approach. Now, a few planning components. When I talk of urban planning, I don't talk urban planning of only town planning. Urban planning is widest sense. There's a town planning component, then there is environmental planning, there's infrastructure planning, there's transport planning. All this planning are part of urban planning. So urban planning is something which administrators understand as general administration. That's how I talk about. Now, it's important that when we plan now, we plan for the economic region as a unit. In that economic region, if it's a first city-led, it will be area surrounding the first city. In a dispersed settlement, it will be a link of dispersed cities which are connected together. Why I talk of this connection? British times and up to 1991, by and large, it was vertical trade which was dominating. So all these things used to collect and go into these 4 cities or another 4-5 cities. So there were these primary cities, secondary cities, and the satellite cities. That's a British pattern, which to a large extent remained the same up to 91. Now this has been disrupted after 91. We are getting a lot of horizontal trade, which is what leads to a balanced urban system. So it's a very positive thing happening and largely market driven. Largely market driven. There are a few planning interventions, but more not as planning intervention. Like master plan is 25% implemented. So one is you use the economic unit and let the urban development authorities plan for this. Or like Hydra in Hyderabad, plan for the full Hydra area. So second is revisit the master plan. It's very rigid, inflexible, cannot foresee cities. Hyderabad master plan could never foresee Hyderabad today in 2001 or 1991. So you revisit the master plan, go in for strategic planning, 2-year intervals, but having a long-term vision. Then there are models of peri-urban area. Either you extend the first city area or you have small municipalities. But there's one model which is emerging. We had metropolitan development committees coming up. It never happened because there is no way any chief minister is going to permit a chairperson of the metropolitan area directly elected next to them. So Hydra led by chief minister. So if you want to have it and you want to be in convergence on all the 51 departments working in these 5 cities, you have to have a chief minister heading this metropolitan development committee. That will bring a lot of convergence. Then other things are standard, like use variable FAR area. Now governance, there are 3 models in India which are there. The first is the Mumbai model, a strong commissioner. There's a Kolkata model, which is the mayor in council. And third is the urban development authority centric model of governance in North India, where DDA, UDA, Ghaziabad Development Authority, they are the major. So now that has to be decided which model you want to. After that, I sincerely believe in this dispersed pattern of Jaya. We have to involve the district collectors in urban areas. And I see that in Telangana. They have removed these ADMs or the joint magistrates and made them in charge of a group of cities. Unless you do that, the regulatory aspects, because there's such a dispersed pattern. It's like villages. District collectors are only villages. So now urban is emerging. Just a broad things I'm just telling you. If you want more, just 2 minutes.
Sure.
I'm sorry if I have. Then when you have these first cities where there is a disconnect between, there will be disconnect because the representative ratio is so high. Means the number of people one elected representative sort of reports to or is accountable to. So I go back to something called democratic administration, where the power over the few inspectors who matter in your life, sanitary inspector, building inspector, light industry inspector, the roads inspector, they start reporting to the citizens. Digital technology permits this to happen. If your demands and preferences count, you're going to take interest in affairs around you. And that is one reason we see so many these gated communities. Gated community is a bad word in urban planning. There's so many gated communities because of this only. That's a place where they take care of housing. How do we do in the small cities, instead of funding construction of houses, in the large cities, instead of construction houses, let us go for rental vouchers. Now DBT is the thing, everybody practices from all governments at the state and center. Now there, people have an opportunity to go live close to the place of work, where the children are studying. They make these trade-offs till they acquire the money in 30s and 40s to build a house themselves. In smaller cities, you continue with this allocating land in your development planning for the poor and develop the housing for them. I think I'll just stop. Yeah, I'll stop off. We've got more items.
Okay, thank you so much, and for setting the context, Dr. Sharma, and you've touched upon many strands and given us food for thought. So I'll kind of now follow up with that, and I'll come to you, Dr. Devalina Kundu. You're the Director, Additional Charge of National Institute of Urban Affairs. You're a professor at the NIUA and have over 20 years of professional experience in the field of development studies. Your focus has been on issues of migration, urbanization, urban development policy, municipal finance, and exclusion, basically. You were a member of the 5th Delhi Finance Commission. And you've studied some of these things that Dr. Sharma alluded to quite in detail. So I would just like to ask you, having studied urbanization patterns across India, can you tell us about the differences that you've observed across states? So Sudeshna also showed that graphic about the different urbanization across states, districts, and cities. So where in some cases benefits are not concentrated, and in some cases they are. So in the case that they're not concentrated in one city, one urban area, what worked and what are some of the lessons for other states?
Thank you for the question.
I think to start with very briefly, I think what Sudeshna rightly pointed out, one is that all states are witnessing urbanization. So there is no question about no city, no state growing. But the pattern of growth is differential. I believe if you look at the census beyond 2011, we do not have the data, but because we are working very closely with the ministry, we have access to data from the states. And what I find is very interestingly, Maharashtra, UP, Bihar and Telangana, these are the four states where more than 100 new statutory towns have been added. And if you look at the size class distribution, it is again the small towns. So there has been, even in the recent past, growth of more small towns. We know that, as Dr. Sharma just now mentioned, that more than 2,530 new census towns were added in the last decade. And we have around 5,000 statutory towns now, 4041 in 2011 and now around 1,000 being newly added. And if you look at the state-wise distribution, we again find that there has been a growth of small towns in the last decade, for which we do not have the census data, but this is data from the government portals. And if you look at big cities, it's only 14. So what we find is again a type of development where we find growth of small towns, and that many have been converted from the census towns to the statutory towns. And basically the maximum growth has happened, as I mentioned, in Maharashtra, UP, Bihar and Telangana. So one point I would like to mention here is that many states like Odisha are also taking up a policy of rural-urban transition. So I was in a meeting with the principal secretary of, the former principal secretary of Odisha, and I asked her how many, because we do not have the census data as of now, could you tell us how many new statutory towns have been added? He said, Madam, only a few, which means now I have the data, so it's only 2 statutory towns have been added in Odisha. So the reason he said, let us first work with the census towns. Let us set a benchmark, create enough infrastructure so that no slum-like condition happens. The mess which we find just now with the statutory towns, that we can arrest to some extent. So that type of development is happening in states like Odisha. And we at the center, we are working, we had the Chintan Shivir on the 29th and 30th of May, where we did talk about peri-urbanization. How do we graduate from census towns to statutory towns? Whether there some incentives could be given to the census towns, because generally if you, we conducted a study a few years back where we did find that there is a lot of resistance from both the institutions I mean the Panchayati Raj institutions, to convert from villages to towns, and also for the citizens at large, because of the taxation, because of the building, the planning norms, most of the settlements are reluctant to convert. So there again, I think if there is some incentivization for conversion, I think that's something which is important. And what is also important is what I think we discussed, we did launch this climate capacity thing. So something for the small towns to absorb the funding, because even if you have funding for the small towns, many of these do not have the capacities to absorb. So something on that lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kundu. This brings us to the governance and capacity issue, basically, and I'll come to you, Dr. Poornima Dore. Dr. Poornima Dore is a distinguished economist. She's known for her work at the intersection of finance, innovation, and digital transformation for India's urban landscape. And as a former Director of Analytics, Insights and Impact at Tata Trust, you have driven impactful programs across business, philanthropy, academia, and government with a focus on data-driven governance, urbanization, and regional growth. You also recently wrote a book about regional growth. Now, during your time at Tata Trust, you designed and rolled out India's first program on city data officers in conjunction with the Smart Cities mission. What kind of capacities do you think we need to use data technology for better governance across these size class of cities? Over to you.
Thanks, Jaya, and thank you for having me here. I think in these narratives of how India's urban growth has been evolving, three actually important factors that I'd like to call out, which need work from a practitioner standpoint. And I will come at this as someone who's been trying to solve for access, been involved with designing programs, looking at how do we build both capacities on ground as well as within government and from the private sector side to, harness what we are calling the big city growth story. So, first things first, when we started looking at are there Indian cities who can actually be showcased on the world stage, and this was around 2014-15 where an exercise of across the ISO standards, which cities actually have even data to say how we are performing across some of the core metrics. We struggled to find 10 cities, and this includes even the larger ones, which were actually having the capacity and the information to say how are we doing on indices around health, education, quality of life. And I bring this up because being able to make sense of where our cities are is very important for us to plan and move forward. And I think all those who are involved very actively in the urban planning side are privy to this fact. So three factors that I think which are very important. One is capacities, both within cities, within the urban network, and with the private sector to be able to be credible partners in this journey is one item, and I'll go a little deeper into each of these. The second is technology and how technology can help harness and support growth across different types of cities, and their city size class becomes important. And the third is the power of the ecosystem and strategic partnerships in making some of this come alive. Now, the fact that we are so diverse, and I think we all saw that slide on how diverse it is within India, and the fact that this urbanization is very distributed, means that across cities and therefore across states, we need to have better capacities to be able to handle this. What we've seen happen is that if, say, there are a set of planners helping one city or a particular state to go deep into, say, their urban planning process and improve on that, the focus becomes very specialized over there. And I think all of us know that when we're looking at that, then we are not looking at the full picture as well. So, in the course of what we worked on with the Smart Cities mission, I think my realization was this, that having capacities within each city to be able to make sense of data, to be able to bring the right technology partner, and to be able to make strategic partnerships work is very important. So, what we worked with the Smart Cities mission at that point was to say that if having this nodal setup within a city is important, and if we look at where the municipal commissioner is today, they are like a big CEO with a lot of list of things on their platter, and this prioritization is what the city plan is all about, right? So how can today's tools, which were not there 15, 20 years back, actually help the decision maker in that seat to, deliver well, to be actually make the system work for them? So one being having something like a city data officer in every city is a very important policy recommendation. It has been tested out at least in the 100 smart cities now, and in the course of through the data cities strategic framework, which I also had the chance to be a part of, building that within what each city can do has meant that at least as a starting point, each city took out a GR among the 100 smart cities, and sir, you must have been part of making some of that happen. It meant that now every city has a nodal person who at least has the designated responsibility to bring some of this together. And so the municipal commissioner has a go-to person when they are trying to, put together even how has my population changed. A lot of people are stopping short of being able to even say how much our population has changed because we don't have the data. Second, across departments, that number is very different. Water department is capturing it differently. Health department has the same number for the same geography is, so bringing some of that together is, I think, the work that has happened over the last few years. So building capacities, so even when we were designing the program, and as course director for that capacity building program, my goal was to see where do we start? So what are frameworks of data, technology, governance that are relevant in the city context? Why is it important for something which has typically been in the purview of the private sector to become very integral to city planning? And if I have to give a very simple example, today we have so many IoT devices in every city which is capturing information. We have the integrated command and control center which is capturing not only data but also video information. These are actually tools which can be used for planning. These are things which have to be harnessed very thoughtfully with data privacy and all of that together, and building that for the variation that is there across cities. So we actually have a wealth of information, but we need very smart, capable people within and outside the cities to build for this. I see this as a huge space from a skilling point of view, because these are jobs that would need to get created. These are very important from a planning point of view. I saw some young people from the School of Planning and Architecture whom I had the chance to meet over lunch. So I'm happy that young people are participating in these conversations. But I do think that capacities, and the second I'll come to is technology. So having tech which is replicable, which is scalable. The earlier conversation on DPIs were around smart buses, etc. I think DPI in urban governance for urban planning is going to be the next thing that all of us should be targeting, where we are using transactional data getting captured across cities and using that for planning. How long are we going to keep waiting for census to happen? And that will be a decadal exercise. So today we have better tools. We should start with some of the cities which have slightly mature tech systems to pull that together, build that as a use case for the other. And the third, as I said, is partnerships. So with stakeholders, both across private and sector, today we have technology tools. We have things like the Digit platform, which a number of cities are using. So using some of these together with use cases across city size class, not limiting them only to the big cities that have capacity, but picking up some tier 2, tier 3, some of these census towns as use cases, I would see as a good way forward to unlock some of these.
Fantastic, and great suggestion on DPI for urbanization. Yes, that seems to be the new frontier. But you mentioned jobs, and how this has the opportunity to create jobs, and not just in the big cities, but all kinds of tiers and classes of cities. So on that question, I'll come to you, Mridula. So Mridula Ramesh is the founder of the Sundaram Climate Institute and the award-winning author of the Climate Solution and Watershed. So it's a jobs plus climate question here. You're focused on, waste and water solutions. You're also an active climate tech angel investor with a portfolio of over 25 startups. You're involved with several initiatives to basically spur climate tech entrepreneurship. And your work with MSME startups, has been quite a bit. And as we know, in small town India, category 2 and 3, that's where a lot of these MSMEs and startups are now taking, shape, and they're taking ground. So the question to you is and meanwhile, because of the climate and the environment angle, a lot of the industrial development that we are seeing now coming up in cities and towns is being pushed out of the core for sort of environmental and other reasons. And that growth is also happening again in the periphery. So coming to you, we know that all of this growth which is happening in unmanaged, ungoverned areas is going to have consequences, So there's the consequences of waste, there's the consequences of water. It will end up producing a lot of waste and, cause sort of changes in our natural systems. So within the current order, how do we deliver on an ambitious economic agenda and a growth story without sort of compromising human health, nature, and sort of planetary outcomes? And how would you see that from the lens of, say, waste?
No, thank you, Jaya, Madhav, and thank you for having me here. As a writer, I always think of narrative, right? And it's amazing to me that when we talk of even the climate narrative in a country like India, which is so vulnerable, the carbon narrative is the one that seems to have taken hold.
And within the carbon narrative, I'm speaking with my investor hat on. Today, if you go to an EV startup, they won't even give you a deck if you're an investor because they've already gotten funding. If you look for a waste startup, they'll be going around with a begging bowl saying, please look at me, I'm looking for funding, I'm looking for a bridge round, etc. And Sundaram Climate Institute just brought out its waste report last month. And what struck me is, even if we stay with the climate narrative and even if we stay with the carbon narrative, managing our waste better is probably more important, just looking at the numbers, than an EV story for India. But it doesn't get that kind of space in the narrative at all. I think WRI put out a study in Bangalore that said managing solid waste accounts for about 11% of carbon emissions in Bangalore. I think if someone there in Bangalore, they can correct me if I'm wrong. But it doesn't capture it. So as a writer, I want to highlight that. The second thing is health, right? Managing solid waste is probably the single biggest thing we can each do for our health. Over the last 6 years, we at Sundaram Climate Institute, we've spoken to about 2,380 plus people in Madurai. We're a tier 4 city, I think. We're not even in the imagination of people in Delhi, but we exist. And what happens is, the capacity for small towns, the funding for smaller towns is themes that have come through the panel. If you don't have money to collect your waste, and if you don't have money to collect your waste daily, people tend to either dump the waste or they tend to burn it. Right? And to your point on data, I think any number that you see on the amount of solid waste that urban India generates is uncertain. We're not measuring that number. So there's a vast range of what is there. But what we do know is a lot is being burnt. And every time it is burnt, the same compound that was released in the Vietnam War and was so dangerous that the American army had to take it away to a faraway island to be burnt. We're putting out that chemical in each of our neighborhoods. So diabetes, cancer, all the hormonal problems that many of the women face today, that comes from the one type of dioxin which burning waste generates. So if you want to manage carbon, if you want to manage your health, please manage your waste. And I'll turn it around. What does managing waste give you for the jobs? I'm looking at the startups that I invest in, and based on conversations with a number of practitioners, we're talking about 1 to 2 million jobs in India, distributed across India, if we stop burning our waste today. You're hearing jobs every day, everywhere in India, and these are dignified jobs. And I think there was, I just saw this little booklet here. It talks about just transition. Today, the recycling that is done by waste pickers. And if you want to see a moral wrong, morality is not something we often mention here. But I think if anybody who works with waste pickers, it's a moral wrong. So, and what is the one thing each of you can take away if you want to stop this? Pay for your waste. Pay for your waste management. Right? We're willing to pay for carbon. We're willing to pay an enormous price for our petrol and diesel and electricity. Why are we not willing to pay for our waste management? And again, when we ask these 2,389 people, do you pay for your waste management? Only 40% said they did. And those were informal bribes, waste collectors to take away your waste, not payments for managing your waste. And until that happens, guys, you're just going to get all your health distortions and waste pickers managing it. And we are part of the solution, and that needs to be part of the narrative.
Thank you very much, Mridula. Zooming out a little bit, this is a very important point. Now, zooming out a little bit and going to the global perspective, Roger, I'm coming to you now. So, Roger Berg is the Global Director of the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. Prior to this, he was at UN Habitat, where he set up the UN Urban Lab Program.
and was created to respond to urban planning demands in cities, which were rapidly expanding and working with sort of 80 cities globally. So, Roger, let's zoom out and let's talk about policy a little bit. Urbanization policy, to be specific. From where you've seen this happen globally, in terms of countries that have a national urbanization policy versus those that don't, right? How have you seen their cities reaching their economic, sustainability, developmental goals? Have those cities, those countries which have an NUP fared better, and have their cities fared better than those that don't? And what are some of the good practices that we here in India can learn from?
Thanks, and a lot has been said already, but this is specific, close to my heart, the national urban policy. And to immediately answer your question, no, they have not fared better. But I will nuance that, of course. This is a provocation. They have not fared better if they consider national urban policy a thing that you have to do, a must-have, an intellectual exercise, identifying a taxonomy of cities. The ones that have fared better have been thinking one step beyond the policy perspective. And I think we have successful cases, we've seen successful cases in how much more kind of regulatory principles, financing mechanisms, and ways of collaboration have been kind of taking shape beyond the national urban policy. So my provocation is to say that, the national policies, so the OECD every 3 or 4 years, they bring out this state of national urban policy report, right? Looking at 160, and Habitat was an integral part of that, 160 national urban policies. And you see of this 160, 90 are more explicit in using the national urban policy as a visioning instrument, as something, as a shared vision, a comprehensive, shared and strategic document. And then the question is, how do you at the national and state level are going to unpack this vision on cities? And I think what is very important, what I've seen in many countries, and I come to a bit more specific examples, but what is very important to really distinguish, and it's been said already, between big primary cities and secondary and tertiary cities. You cannot, same policy doesn't adapt, doesn't apply to each of these cities, and especially everywhere in the world, doesn't matter if it's developed countries or developing countries, second and third tier cities are just are really way less capacitated. So the question is, so how do you bring second tier cities in this conversation, in this policy considerations? And national urban policy can be about pretty much everything, but I mean, boiling it down, I do think that, infrastructure investment is so incredibly unforgiving, right? You can do it once and you do it right or you do it wrong. So the big question I think here on the table is, looking at the urbanization rate and what you sketched in your introduction, actually how many additional urban population we see coming to Indian cities. How do you deal in a right way with your infrastructure investment? And how do you make sure that they drive the economy and will not destroy your natural resources and agricultural land? And I've been involved in many much more kind of planning exercises at the regional. It always boils down to this kind of very, very practical consideration: infrastructure planning, land use, and protection of natural resources, natural land use and natural ecosystem. So that's one thing. Then I think being successful, the ones that are successful are really looking at how to shape, in my opinion, three things: support to less capacitated cities. So how can you help them to actually access federal or international resources to kind of invest in solutions? The second is very much, what are the ways in order to incentivize cross-border collaboration? We saw these beautiful images of growing cities, and it's not only the big cities, there are many cities that grow over their administrative boundaries. So this kind of cross-border collaboration is really crucial. And we've seen, for example, in national urban policy implementation in Mexico, we see the Mexico Metro Fund, which really invests in cross-border infrastructure, but there's also a platform, an organization, it's called Sedatu, who helps with actually facilitating that collaboration. Because it's difficult, right, to get this collaboration right. Similar things you see, for example, in the execution or implementation strategy of the National Urban Policy in Canada, where you think about, how do you deal, for example, with the Metro of Vancouver, similar challenges, but also similar collaborative approaches and solutions. And I think that the third thing is then what are your frameworks for finance? And it's not only about financing the actual investment, but also potentially linking funding to planning processes. For example, one of the challenging things that we now see in the US, in the US, you have the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, whatever. But it's more than $1 trillion. I think it's 1.4 trillion US dollars to potentially trickle down to cities. But in the US, we see that small and second-tier cities have no clue how to identify a project that can pull from national resources. So I think these are a couple of challenges and a couple of solutions or potential pathways to make national urban policies successful. And I know you want to give, but I just want to give you one anecdote, right, to come back on my first provocation. So if you do it right, you have beautiful economic and also spatial outcomes. And I'm from the Netherlands. I'm from the Netherlands, which you all know is a shiny, tiny little state with an airport somewhere at the North Sea, right? It's compared to India, it's nothing, right? But we're actually very famous for national urban planning, which is really organized how the metropolitan areas, how the landscapes are preserved, how we deal with water management. Then, I think early 2000s, we thought, okay, you don't need it anymore, right? I mean, it's small, we've done it, we understand. 20 years later, right now, the government is in a complete limbo. Energy transition requires spatial innovation and space for windmills, for solar. Climate crisis, where we put our water, how we retain our water, How do we deal actually with the housing crisis? So not having a national urban policy, not having a national spatial approach is going to give you an enormous headache. I mean, and that's what we are experiencing right now in the Netherlands.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that, Roger. And coming to sort of country transitions and economic sort of transformation, Madhav, I'm going to come to you now. So Madhav Pai is the CEO of WRI India. Madhav, you were one of the founding members of WRI India, and under your leadership, the organization has supported many pioneering projects in Dore BRT, the Rahagiri campaign for democratizing public streets, the National Electric Bus Program, and so on and so forth. So from where you sit and, based on your experience, where do you see this, going in terms of the country transition, what we need to do, and what do you see are the roles of strategic planning and strategic projects?
Thanks, Jaya. I mean, I think a lot has been said, so just adding on top to, I'll make 4 points. I think one is, the fact that the top 10 cities, and we heard in the morning also, are going to drive a significant part of the economic growth in the country. We have, and most of that is happening outside the sort of, the municipal limits. That's clearly a space we need to, so these peri-urban areas around the large cities, there has to be a program that sort of focuses on it and figures out how we make that work, because that is clearly an immediate opportunity, and most of the economic growth is going to happen there. And if we don't do that, I think we will not capture the full potential of what is possible. So that's one thing. I think Mr. Sharma also referred to the next 10, 15 cities, right, which is where now these businesses that are finding land too expensive are moving, right? So the next 15, 20 cities, and so if you really look at the top 10 metropolitan cities, we are actually 30 million plus cities get addressed. Mumbai is 10 cities, Delhi is 10 cities, like that, right? So then there is this next 15, 20 cities, I think we have to focus and make sure that we don't land up in this big peri-urban problem that we have had in these sort of top cities, and how we can do slightly more dispersed development also, similar to the Coimbatore example that was shown, I think, for example, Indore, there was, there is like, there are these, you can create like slightly dispersed development, but still focused and not. So I think then a lot of the other, you will have another 30 cities, 25 cities, which will be state capitals, really, where you are getting government and education as the primary base. So I think having slightly more classified thinking specific to these cities, I think is something that can be done, and criteria on that could be developed quite easily. I know these are also politically difficult problems, but I think something can be done so that you are at least doing some classified strategy of how you are going to build the infrastructure programs for the top 100 cities kind of a thing, and clearly having the economic development perspective, right? So how do you, if you put $1 of infrastructure, how are you going to create $10 of economy? And I think that thinking also has to be brought in this. I think separately, I think small towns, I think we have to figure out, I mean, that's the second thing, has to have a clear strategy. And again, there, I think what we are seeing in our analysis that Sudeshna also shared, right, that anything that's along the highway, along certain other infrastructure. So again, a two-dimensional classification of these small towns and figuring out then how, they could, I mean, some of them are whether they're just district towns or, they grow differently. So that's so this classification, a little more effort, and then sort of really, figuring out how these allocations of infrastructure financing support that is done, and clear linkage to economic planning. In the morning also we heard about the economic viability sort of conversation. So how do you really put in an investment that you get a land? The second part, the third part I would say, Dr. Sharma referred JNR, 20 years. See, today, given the amount of increase in urban financing that has happened, if you add up all the scheme numbers, it's something like $250 billion of, this is the allocation amount. So it doesn't get consumed, but there's up to 250 billion, including state contribution and all of that has happened in these 7 or 8 sort of ongoing urban programs. That's substantial money. As we have increased the public funding, actually there has been a big reduction in private sector money coming into urban infrastructure kind of a thing. And again, I think that's, and part of it they are saying is bankability of projects. And I do think that over the 20 years, even though we have been able to do urban work, we haven't created a cadre of very good professionals to prepare good projects. And I feel part of the problem is that these schemes get announced and then in 6 months, every city has to submit a DPR, so there is never good time for project preparation. So the essentially decoupling project preparation and project financing is essential. I think that will lead to creation of also this professional cadre to do these good, well-designed urban projects, which also have, the user fees and the financial models fully integrated into it. So I think that for me is really sort of the sort of the metropolitan areas, the second classification, and I think really also mainstreaming the economic development thinking through all of this becomes extremely critical. But these are just some thoughts. These are less policy, more program type of suggestions. But I think this is clearly the window to think about these things.
No, and that's important. I mean, it's not just about the class sizes of different cities and different sort of tiers of urban, but also the economic development and the economic activity layer on top of it. So now, Mr. I think Srinivas is on his way and will be joining us shortly. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to request is that, ask a quick follow-up question. It's a follow-up question that would have deserved 5 to 10 minutes each, but I'm going to give you 1 minute to respond to it. And so we'll have to be quick. I'll start with you, Mridula, and coming to sort of this, sort of incentives and economics. So what Madhav just ended with. What do you think are some of the political and economic incentives, especially in peri-urban areas, for cities to manage their growth better and to take care of their environment?
In the 1 minute, I'm going to try and pack as much as I can. When you talk of peri-urban unplanned expansion, the one word that comes again and again is land, right? And very often when cities, governments want to build out infrastructure like a bus terminal or a school or a primary health center, they don't have land for it. And the one type of land that very often gets taken up are tank beds, which are lake beds. Okay, so in city after city, you see these tanks being overcome. I live in a place called Chokki Kulam. Kulam in Tamil means tank. There is no Kulam there. Okay, and I got into climate because we ran out of water at home. But my institute's study, we looked at 100 tank systems and crowdsourced groundwater. A functional tank recharges water by about 200 feet. So when you look at Delhi, which has 1,000 water bodies apparently, at least on paper, if you had actually managed it, you won't have a groundwater crisis. But why don't people do that? So I'm going to go to two data points that we came across. One is we went out and asked people, would you vote on water? And we asked this in 2019, which was an El Nino year. And many of the people were getting water once in 4 days. Quick answer, most people said, no, we will not vote on water. Things like caste, religion, freebies are all much more important. So if you don't vote for something, please don't hold your breath for either good policy or good implementation of policy, which is the same thing. The second thing is ADR does a study, again, talking to a much larger sample set of 250,000 people, I think, and they ask people to spell out their government priorities. Clearing encroachments on public spaces, including tanks, was the last priority. So when you put these two together, you don't have a political incentive to manage water bodies at all. To the economic incentive, most people will say we shouldn't pay a price for water. Okay, and price, when you think of it as a signal, that means you have the tanker mafia which comes out to pray every summer in Bangalore, and you have a booming borewell market. But every water startup which can solve your problem is looking for funding.
Thank you. So coming to that, and resources have a regional context. They have also economic implications. So Poornima, coming to you, and the book that you wrote about regional economic development, why is the context of the region important, and how do we look at it? Because there is no sort of governance mechanism right now, or there's weak governance around sort of regions. And we say, cities contribute to 60% of our GDP. Madhav just, mentioned that a lot of that is, peri-urban and all of that. What is the nature of the economic contribution of peri-urban areas as you understand it?
So I think when we talk about regions, there is one way of looking at it, which is that what is the adequate size from a planning point of view as well as from a decision-making point of view. At state is too large. Most of the state level planning that we talk about, I think is not able to capture the kind of variation that we've been talking about. Sub-state, which is a set of districts, the NSS defines regions very interestingly, where India is divided into about 85 regions. I think that's a very interesting classification. I do go into that in depth in my book as well. But the reason why that kind of captures my imagination is that we have 800 plus districts. We have so many cities. Now, what is the right unit at which some kind of decision making can happen? I think the regional context, if we look at NSS as a set of districts within a state, is a good way of bringing together both industry, because industry needs to have at least a significant catchment if they are trying to look at economies of scale, etc. But also where is their competitive advantage? So I think what is the competitive advantage of a region is a very important thing to figure out, to plan for. Cuts of things like PLFS and other data sets also could be looked at to bring that together. But figuring out, and one can do that at whichever unit one wants to look at it, but figuring out which are those sectors that are driving the regional economy, I think is very important. We have never done that when we talk about planning, we talk about land use, we talk about all of those things, but economic planning, what kind of jobs are people currently employed in across these regions? Which are we have the NIC and CO classification, all of that. Using that to arrive at what are those avenues of competitive advantage that a region already has. So if there are 5 or 6 sectors which seem to be creating employment today, being able to figure that out and think about, okay, 10 years from now, is that still going to happen? Are there newer avenues that we need to create? And I think one important thing to look at in planning is what are the adjacencies. So, for example, if you have people who are very skilled in some aspects of construction, who from that region are typically getting skilled, then there are many adjacencies around construction which that region can become a hub for. So, mapping that out also is, I think, very critical. And the peri-urban story is typically, as you said, businesses which are buying land, which are setting a lot of their operations, which are either people intensive or capital intensive, which you cannot put in the city, are going into the peri-urban locations. So that is again a competitive advantage story there. So identifying those, so for example, we do have district towns. Today I see there are district towns which are increasingly now going to have some level of human capacity to be able to provide, say, certain kind of technology services. We are seeing patterns of people going back to their home state and wanting to build something there now that some kind of funding, some interest, some buzz around the smart city story or the peri-urban story is happening. So how can both industry and government create some of those pools where you are identifying these are 4 or 5 sectors that this region is going to build competitive advantage on for the next 5-10 years, and then building on that. I think that is where we need to do research, we need to seed that in programs. Policy will, I think, follow, but programs which build that out, which are able to say that, okay, we'll do skilling around this, we'll do job creation around this, can industry do 3-4 pilots? Building that around peri-urban regions with a competitive advantage mindset, I think may bring in capital as well.
So that's great. So basically looking at what is the economic advantage in certain regions and then sort of building on that to speak for peri-urban. Dr. Kundu, coming to you, quick question on, you talked about also the, Odisha, the rural to urban transition and the policy that they've set up. What is a successful example of this having happened and say, for example, peri-urban areas doing well by design, and what were the sort of drivers of this?
Odisha has just initiated this. I think success will come in the future. We are currently working on that. But if you ask me what are the drivers, I would suggest finance. I think finance is very important, planning, and governance, including capacity. For finance, what Odisha has also done, they have gone for the concept of shared services. The Jal Sathis, who were there at the community level to collect taxes, water charges, they are now, because they functioned quite efficiently, they have been now asked to collect property taxes as well. Then the concept of pooled financing, I think that worked well for the southern states. And also, when we talk about the peri-urban areas where we find more of small towns, I think the 16th Finance Commission grant should look at these small towns, because large cities, as Mr. Madhav already mentioned, I think they do have the economic potential to harness local taxes. But what happens to the small towns which are really unable to do so? So I think that should be more of incentivized grants towards the small towns. And it would also be important to have some, we did have the National Commission on Urbanization in the 80s, but now I think it's high time we have another commission on urbanization. The Kerala Urban Commission is there with the state of Kerala, but other states we do not find so. So I think it would be important to have one commission there. And we need to strengthen ward level governance. That was one of the terms of the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. That happened to a certain extent. So we need to revisit the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, recognize slums as the fourth tier of governance. You asked me about Odisha. Odisha has also done this. And in the state of Gujarat, we find for the small towns, the governance, they have initiated a new system of governance where 20-25 urban local bodies, small towns, are being governed by regional commissioners. So we could bring something of that sort in other states. The financial intermediaries like the KUIDFC or the 2FITCO, so those could be brought in, and training and capacity of staff. I think that's very important. Looking at the HR structure of small towns, bringing in resilience officers, data officers, and pooling of resources. Yeah, I think that's important. for not only the big cities but the peri-urban areas, including the small towns there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think capacity, again, something spoken about a lot, and how do you increase this in many places. I would now like to invite Secretary, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Mr. Srinivas, to please join us on stage to deliver your keynote speech. Sir, I'm going to pause this here and then join us for the last. So over to you.
How are you? Thank you all, and my apologies for the delay, and I know I must have made some of you wait. And honestly, I would have really loved to hear all of you before I had a chance to react. But I must at the very outset express my gratitude and happiness both to WRI for having invited me here, giving me an opportunity to be amongst all of you, and for an opportunity, honestly, I do not know to share what, but share something. Now, when I was invited, I told them, I see, this is a sector I deeply care for. I have invested a good part of my time, life, thought in this sector, but it's been almost a decade since I've been away from it. So I'd like to really refresh my impressions, but then as somebody who has lived like all of us have and do in urban areas, concerned with what is happening in the urban areas, urbanization and so on, I felt it was slightly premature for me to come within 15 days of having taken over and then deliver a keynote address. So as I was thinking, so I think what I will try and do is do a little bit of loud thinking, and loud thinking without even too much of preparation, which means it's very honest. So as I was reflecting on what we all, and I know all of us share this aspiration, all of us share this large dream, and all of us are contributing in significant ways to what we are doing with the way we live. And all of us have also participated in the journey of our nation and our thought in terms of what are the large processes that are impacting our lives. And we all know that there was a point in time we identified urbanization as one of those great virtuous economic force that enabled unraveling and unlocking of a lot of value both in terms of social life, social indicators, value in economic terms, value in terms of opportunity for new types of employment and so on and so forth. So I really don't want to dwell on any of the institutional efforts that have happened. I really, even today, and as I stand here, I should be very honest in saying, I am, in my own mind, trying to assess my own understanding of what do we mean by urbanization. What do we mean by rural versus urban? What are we talking when we talk about this transitional zones, whether we call it suburban? As the Honorable Prime Minister had coined a very important phrase, I think it's almost a policy direction, and long time back when he was Chief Minister, he used to articulate the idea of urban, how there is a continuum between rural and urban. And since I belong to the cadre, Gujarat cadre, I also participated and understood some of the thought behind it. So when I reflect on all of this, I feel it is perhaps time to think of a new social compact. I think it is time for us to have some kind of a new social contract in terms of our understanding even. Am I urban? Am I rural? Am I urban? Am I something else? What do I own? Do I own? What is the space I share? Do I co-share? Am I simply a passenger, passive bird of passage? Or am I also going to contribute? How do I have these negotiations going on between other members of the community, society, living in different parts, other parts of the geography, if I may put it that way. So I think personally, and as I said, this is my current deep thought that is going on and influencing me in terms of, are we right anymore in holding on to some of our old assumptions? The reason I say it is 20 years back, we would have been right in holding a city boundary to say, okay, this is urban and what is outside is not urban. Perhaps if we would have been right 20 years back to say, okay, this is the city water supply system and we're going to draw some water and then distribute it very efficiently, very well, and make sure that there is a zero impact on the outside. But is it now good enough? Where does the water come from? What is the connect between the source of the water and the consumer of the water? We are also talking about production. Where is production happening? Where is consumption happening of products, goods? And where are the impacts also happening? So let us say, where does solid waste go? And climate being a public good is impacting us everywhere. No matter where, whether you are living in a municipal boundary, census boundary, or any other boundary, it is agnostic to that. So therefore, I feel now, after having moved from a city type or an urban type of a planning and thinking to a slightly more expanded regional type of a thinking, and then we were also started thinking in a very techno-legal manner. That's a phrase I'd like to use. That all right, we will have an institutional mechanism of sort, which is grounded by legislation and statute of sorts. And therefore, we can then hold it together, and within that construct, we would then start making sense of what is going on with our world. Perhaps that is also no longer true. So how do we deal with it? How do we reassess where we are? And how do we evaluate what kind of impulses do we take in? What kind of data do we seek to assess and understand where we are and where we go forward? So I would only like to leave a small thought. I'd like to share that thought with you because it is an aspiration that together as a society, we need to have a new compact. We need to rethink a lot of these things differently. We need to question our own assumptions. And therefore, as I said, it is a new social contract that is needed between all of us, no matter where we live. Many of us are itinerant. We live in a city in the morning, go outside in the afternoon or in the evening, sleep somewhere else. It's no longer as if we all are pure urban of a certain sort. No longer are those who live in pure rural areas of sort. Past few days I was listening to getting access to some of the wonderful research that you have carried out in WRI. And one very interesting facet of that data really popped up. And the data point was that in the NCR region, some of the biggest growth that happened in the NCR region, which led to a lot of employment and GDP, was agri-sector growth. Very counterintuitive, right? I mean, you would not think that growth in the NCR region is a product of agri or agri-based and agri-processing industry. But you find that is happening. Expansion is happening because of that. So therefore, unless we revisit our old assumptions that urban would mean this, urban would mean this nature of job, this nature of occupation, this nature of service, and rural would mean this, and therefore that old construct perhaps no longer is valid. So I would ask all of you, and I'll urge all of you to kindly think whether there is an opportunity to reassess our thought frameworks, whether there's an opportunity for us to reevaluate our assumptions, and whether there is an opportunity for us to, in that context, if we all agree, because we need to have a compact in this hall, because most of us are dealing with urban in one form or the other, either as a practitioner, a manager, an administrator, maybe even an academic thought leader, influencing policy advisor. But all of us, it's a very small number. But there is a much larger society that also needs to engage in this conversation. And unless we have this larger compact happening, perhaps we will find our current level of thinking short of the challenges that are ahead of us. And the challenges are quite large, and they are not insurmountable. So therefore, I do not take any pessimistic view on it. I know they are surmountable. They can be met head on. It's just that we need to configure our thoughts. We need to organize ourselves better. And then we can utilize this as a great opportunity to leapfrog. Because one of the big points that we are all talking about, urbanization, I saw somewhere saying that most of the urbanization of the world might come out of 3 or 4 countries. And we'll naturally be contributing to that. We are also seeing that as the growth of our country happens, a substantial portion of our population will get added to the urban areas in the next 25 years. So if you really look back and say, okay, most of you who are young would all be the children of JNNURM and beyond. So that means you're all a population or children who are a product of an urban planned process. Somewhere you have participated in it, somewhere you have received some degree, and to get it, maybe a large degree of public good out of it, and now you are participating and contributing to it. But if you step back in 2060 and look back on 40 years behind, or 45 years behind, you would say that we made our own world. So in order for us to make our own world, do we have the matrices around which we are building the new social compact? So this is the large thought I wanted to leave with you. I really don't want to talk about specifics, what we are doing, what we are not doing, what government is doing, not doing, because honestly I'm trying to understand what government is doing. So if I speak here that government is doing this, it will be attributed to government, which is unfair. Because although I'm serving government in this capacity currently, it will take me some time to speak reasonably, cogently and coherently and authoritatively about it. But all that I want to say is, all of us are stakeholders in this. All of us have a big role, not only in shaping our destiny, but in shaping what should be our future. And I again don't want to say urban future. I want to say that there is a new compact that we need to build around. A new society that has to be built with different definitions. Let us not label ourselves into a corner. I think we should go beyond labels, build new labels if at all, and then have, I think, maybe a degree of modesty that the road ahead must be designed better. Somehow in the urban sector I have seen, and I have been a part of this sector, we like designing very well. We like drawing a line and saying, okay, everything will go like this. We like defining a particular boundary and say, okay, everything is going to be planned within this. And suddenly we find everything happens outside of that line. So literally the interesting conundrum is where you draw the line is the limit of our own imagination. Imagination, what happens is beyond our imagination. So I wish you, I know you've had a long day, so thank you very much for listening to me patiently. And do consider what I said, because this is the stage at which my current mind is. If you share it, do start from that point. We'll have this conversation going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. So, Mr. Srinivas, thank you very much. I think what I'm taking away from what you said is a couple of things. One is sort of challenge our own assumptions that we have about what is urban, what is not, etc. Rewire our mental models, right? To think about the old classifications, vis-a-vis how do we need to think about it now. And I think the takeaway for me really largely from what you've said is that let's have an open mind to kind of reframe what is urban, to rethink what is needed for the future growth, and prosperity of our city. So thank you very much for that. I would like to ask you one question before we leave though. And I would like to start by saying firstly, congratulations, sir, for taking this position on as Secretary of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs.
You have been instrumental in leading many transformative initiatives, both at the national and the subnational level, starting from sort of implementing the 74th Amendment to the GIFT City in Gujarat. You have a lot of illustrious work there, and using that as a lever for economic development. So, according to you, the one question that I would like to ask you, what are some critical information needs, decision support systems and tools that would be helpful in developing more sort of effective long-term interventions and urban policies, especially as you're exploring the space now?
Thank you. It's a very, I think, vast question. Let me answer by saying that I personally believe, and it has been my experience, that it is how we can reduce information asymmetry in this entire process that would help us in ensuring that the intended outcomes are better. And I speak from a small, maybe I'll give a small example. You did mention GIFT City, and therefore I'll start from that point. I remember when GIFT was getting designed, and there was a lot of conversation happening. Nothing was on the ground. It was pure virgin land. And there was a village there, and the village had a cemetery. Okay, the cemetery and the village was not too far away from each other. So one of the first interventions, it was roughly around Diwali time, and as you know, Diwali in Gujarat and most of northern India is a very auspicious period. Everybody is happy. So one of the first things that my team did was to go to the villages. There were several villages who were part of the boundary zone, and made presentations as if we were making presentations in Vandakurla, saying that, you know what, where you are sitting, you can expect to see this kind of a growth. You can expect to see these kind of buildings. You can expect to see this kind of infrastructure. And at that point in time, I can tell you the cost of land there was 15 lakhs a biga. Okay. So we told them straight up front that if you do not need money, for God's sake, don't sell land. Hello? That is the first thing we did. We said, please do not sell land if you don't need the money. Just hold on to it. You will not regret it. Of course, story has, then of course everybody knows the story thereafter. So one of the important aspects of, I think, a lot of this urban or whatever growth, urban, whatever, public driven, private driven, is, if I sincerely believe this, is information should be shared very equitably across all sections of society, so that they are able to take informed decisions, rational decisions, and they are not hustled into some kind of a suboptimal decision. I think that is one very important thing. How to make information as transparent, as easily accessible, and as easily understandable as possible. I think this is the core, in my view, of every sort of an intervention that leads to or promises growth. Sometimes it may not happen. It doesn't happen for some reasons. It may get delayed by a few years, a decade even. But a public or a society that is informed by that information does not protest. It participates. So I think this is one important method. So therefore, I think we need a very strong communication capability. Stakeholder building. How do we communicate? How do we engage? And how do we constantly get that feedback loop? The second dimension, of course, which flows from this is how do we listen better? How do we hear and then put it back into the system? So that what we hear would also help us in improve continuously. And when I was saying it in a bit of a humor, all of us, like I said, we tend to believe in the power of our own decision, power of our own idea, power of our own plan. That, yeah, you know what, we've consulted this, we have made this plan, it's a great plan, it will last forever, next 40 years, right? So and so 41, so and so 27. And then we say we have heard everything, we have put everything we know into it. And then we have the loss of the land which hold it together. Nobody can make a change to it. Somewhere, as I said, perhaps we lose the opportunity of allowing dynamism. So I think these are some of the large issues. We will go there as we journey together. My point again is that we need to engage. We need to build these stakeholder participative engagements. We need to have this new compacts. We need to have these new conversations. And we need that ability to build this. It's not easy to say all of this. It may sound very nice, but how do you really do it? How do you do it? How do we enable that kind of information to come in? And once that information come in, how do you process it well? How do you ensure that the person who is given that information does not feel let down, that you know what, you have not taken me seriously enough? That's also not a fair thing. Everybody should be taken fairly. So these are some of the things. Best again.
Thank you very much, sir. So basically, you're talking about awareness and agency, really largely to determine our own futures and outcomes. And as we know, there are no silver bullet solutions, only trade-offs. It's just a matter of knowing what those trade-offs are, the ones which are bearable, and then making decisions collectively on what we are willing to live with. So thank you very much for that. I will now hand it over to Radha. And we can go on about this session for another 2 hours. So we've been talking about this. We touched upon many issues of governance, some of the case examples from different states and cities in India. We talked about information. So a lot of our panelists here bring all of those insights for us. And we talked about some global examples, what works, what doesn't work. We talked about the importance of building climate resilience, building sort of resource resilience and efficiency in our cities, and not neglecting that, because that's going to be the primary sort of indicator of quality of life in cities and urban areas. And we talked about sort of some of the states and cities which are taking on, new sort of policies, rural to urban transitions and so on and so forth, to ensure that the transitions which are happening right now are sustainable and they're on the right path and the right trajectories. So I will have to wrap this up now, because we have, as you can see, a lot of the panel sessions have started again. But I will do that. First, we would like to just have a launch of one of the publications that we've created, sir, with you. And Radha, I'll put to you for that. Nandini?
Just for the photos.
Yes. And do you want to just mention 2 lines about this publication?
This is a study that we've done in Bangalore, which sort of focuses on it's not such a new buzzword anymore. We've been hearing about transit-oriented development for, since 25 years now. But the potential of TOD to play a critical role in as an economic development tool, so for creating sort of economically productive cities. And the critical piece within that is, of course, bringing housing and jobs closer to mass transit stations. So our publication actually focuses on this challenge, the relationship between jobs and mass transit. How do you enable jobs growth close to mass transit stations? We use the case of Bangalore to highlight the sort of challenges that large businesses face, what the potential enablers are, and to make the case for the significant benefits and co-benefits. So this is a working paper that's our latest publication, which we'd like to launch.
Thank you, Radha. Thank you very, very much for this very sort of nuanced and insightful conversation today. And thank you for joining us. In conclusion.